Well, hello and good morning to this latest episode of the Social Housing Podcast from Voicescape. My name is Peter Hudson, Sales Director at Voicescape, and I'm joined today by Ian Wright from the Disruptive Innovators Network. Good morning, Ian.
Good morning, Peter. Nice to be here.
Very good. So, Ian, let's start off with the broad topic. Tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and what led you to start the Disruptive Innovators Network.
Right, well, a bit of a mixed background in terms of roles, but always sort of within the social housing sort of setting. Sort of 36 years working in the sector. It's a brilliant sector to work in. Did all of the usual things in my early years. Housing officer, walking around the patch, managing the properties, things like that. Then policy, strategy, regeneration, everything. But I'm probably sort of best known for within the sector in terms of managing a couple of the big membership bodies, membership organisations within the sector. Um, and up until about sort of 6 years ago, I was sort of very happily sort of ploughing a furrow there in corporate life. And then sort of just decided with the pace of change that we could see coming and sort of certainly disruption coming down the line that actually a lot of housing organisations are probably going to need some help in terms of some of the digital transformation they're going to have to go through.
Yeah.
Packed in the well-paid, secure final salary pension job and decided to set up the Disruptive Innovators Network, which, as you may guess, is a community, is a network. So it's a membership body for those leaders within social housing who are wanting to get prepared for the disruption, but more importantly, to become more corporately innovative within the business. So been going just about 5 years now, certainly the biggest transformation and innovation network within the social housing sector, about 130 members, and very much enjoying what we're doing.
Very good, excellent. And when we met a couple of weeks ago, and you were telling me about the three main things that the Disruptors Innovative Network focuses on, that's around technology, leadership, and culture. Can you just dive into that a little bit for me?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've spent a lot of time observing organisations both within the sector and outside of the sector. I've run many leadership programs, taking leaders inside lots of different businesses from, the big tech companies like Google and Apple and Amazon and things, through to some of the retail sectors, through to some other areas that are perhaps sort of less well known. And I think there was a number of sort of common threads that ran through all these organisations, particularly the ones that were really sort of high performing, highly creative, highly innovative. And that tended to be the strands around the way they use and understand technology, the way that those organisations were led and the traits that sort of came from that, and then the culture that the organisation had built up. It doesn't actually go in that order, technology, leadership, or culture. It's just TLC is the only way I can sort of remember my own strap line, to be honest. But technology is normally the last thing that comes into these sort of equation. But you get all of those three elements right, and invariably you will have, as I say, a highly performing, highly creative, highly innovative business.
Fantastic. Okay. And I think, when we start to think about innovation, particularly in the social housing sector, they're not two things that are synonymous often with one another. But do you think that the expectations of tenants and residents is changing? And is there being enough done by providers to the sector or even to the providers in the sector to adopt those technologies?
Oh, without doubt, it's increasing, Peter. I think one of the things that we sort of look at within the social housing sector is that we're a very special sector. We're unique in terms of what we do. My preposition has always been is that, we're just a service provider. It's a very important service, providing a good quality, affordable, safe, warm home, but it is a service. And in terms of how we are judged, tenants and residents, all the ones I've spoken to anyhow, just, compare the experiences they get from their landlord against what they get from other service providers, whether it's a retail delivery from a Tesco or an Asda, whether they're getting in an Uber or,
Yeah.
something from Amazon, they then judge us against, well, how was that experience? And what I've sort of seen over the last certain 3 or 4 years is that the rate of tenants and residents' expectations is rising at an exponential rate much quicker than what landlords are able to respond to.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Can you give me some insight as to why you think those expectations are rising? Some examples, perhaps.
Yes, of course, and again, it's something that we see all around us, Peter. Particularly the sort of the use of technology. But when you think about it from a tenants and residents perspective, they're no different to you or I in terms of the way we use service. And if you look at things such as social media is all about speed, speed, speed. So therefore, the expectation is, I want an instant response around this. Technology obviously is just getting faster and faster all of the time. The ability to sort of personalize things, I think, is really, really important. Other companies know a lot about me through the data that I share or they
Hmm.
collect from me, and a landlord is no different. I want a personal. I want you to remember the last conversation that you had with me. And in a lot of respects now, with the way sort of people engage, quite often, and this is an area I think landlords have really got to sort of work on, is that the tenant and the resident may actually know more than the landlord about what's going on. They
Yeah.
may go and check out the web page. They may just sort of Google. They may look at the news and things around that. So I think that's something we've got to sort of think about. But it's this always on service that people expect, and whether this is about a good self-service experience or actually, I've got an emergency and I need some help as well. I think also the emergence of sort of social influencers, social housing activists, Kwejo Kwenbo is a good example of that, have brought social housing more into the mainstream in terms of actually, yeah, if I'm not getting a good service, I want to do something about this. And then finally, I suppose it's all of the different social channels that are available. A
Hmm.
landlord, is expected to, I think, actually be on top of all of those various different channels and be able to provide a response through them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're quite uniquely positioned with the network that you provide. In a triangle, I suppose, of technology providers to the sector of social landlords themselves, and also those tenants. So what does that feedback loop look like? So when you're starting to understand the challenges that tenants are facing, how the landlords can respond to them, and then how the service providers can help bridge that gap. What's that feedback mechanism look like?
Well, a lot of the stuff that we do, Peter, is what we call discovery learning. Basically,
Hmm.
we have a preposition or we have a theory that we want to sort of test, and we'll go out there into the real world and sort of see how that actually sort of comes about. What that means is that quite often we'll be, we'll have an expectation or have a thought about this when actually we go and test it. Actually, that's not the experience around that. So one of the things that we do, particularly with technology providers, is we do a lot of experimentation and we put this into what we call a DIN lab. So a
Yeah.
DIN lab is a rapid prototyping platform whereby new market entrants, startup community can basically engage with social housing providers in a way that we call it test before you invest. I think part of the lessons I've learned over 30 odd years working with technology companies is that basically, sometimes the promise that is out there, what problems it will help you solve, doesn't actually meet the reality. Not necessarily because the technology doesn't do it, because we haven't got the processes, the system, or the organizational culture right to actually sort of use it. So there's a whole plethora of reasons. So what I'm really interested in is, how does this sort of technology actually work within your organization? And
Yeah.
then, like any good corporate innovator, you'd get a small patch over here, you would test it out, you would see whether it meets the promises. And once it does, we then move on to the other challenge, which is, how do you scale that technology
Yeah.
across the whole of the business? Because I think one of the challenges that certainly the startup community who we work with face is that, they'll do a proof of concept, they'll demonstrate that their technology will actually work over here. But then instead of saying, yeah, we know that works now, we'll roll it out across 20,000 units across our business, it's, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give you another 100 just to prove it does it again. And I think this shows sort of a lack of confidence within the sector that this is a sound investment. And this leads on to something else, which we'll probably come on to talk about, which is about the digital literacy of leaders within the sector as well, that we have to look at. But the feedback loop is one very much of, we will we'll hold your hand as we go through this. We'll get the right organizations involved in the lab for your technology.
Yeah.
So there's no point, you know what's like, organizations have different business cycles. There's no point in trying to implement something if it's not actually a problem that's needing to sort of be solved. So basically, we do spend a lot of time in terms of due diligence, I suppose, matching up the landlords
Mm.
to the technology providers.
Yeah, that's right. And it seems to be, a mutually beneficial relationship that. So you're lowering the barrier of entry and risk for the social landlord, but giving exposure to the providers. So I imagine there's loads of great collaborative workings come out of that. So how would a technology provider or a landlord engage with you to broker that relationship in?
Well, first of all, I mean, they approach us, or we will spot them somewhere, and we will pick them out. I mean, we tend to sort of focus on, as I say, new market entrants who are coming in to sort of solve a particular problem, or perhaps something from abroad. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we do is international. A lot of the tech providers that we've ended up sort of working with have been doing something interesting in Europe, and they're looking at the UK market, and we want to see whether that technology is sort of transferable across here. But ultimately, it's about being a very clear business about the problem they're looking to solve within the social housing sector. One of the things which wound me up during the COVID crisis was the amount of approaches we got from companies who said, "Oh, we've got a £5,000 module here; it will do X kind of thing."
Hmm.
They weren't looking at it through the lens of our members, which is, what is the problem you're sort of looking to sort of fix here? Because it might not even be a technological problem.
Yeah.
It might actually be, well, actually, your processes, your systems, your methodology are not sort of right for this. But I think, as I say, we live in a very interesting sort of time now, and I think organisations are realising that actually they are substantially analog businesses in the digital world. And part of what we're trying to sort of do with DIN is make that journey as frictionless as possible and as quick as possible to move them onto that digital path. So ultimately, tenants and residents will gain the benefit from those technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'm interested to hear a little bit more about some of the providers that you look to for inspiration. So you talked about technology providers from Europe, and I know that you've taken the opportunity to travel a bit further afield with the group in. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, our premise has always been is that, there's loads of good stuff going on within housing, but we don't exist in a bubble. Tenants and residents' experiences are sort of, much wider than that. So therefore, we have to look beyond that. And, I've spent sort of the last 15 years looking outside of the sector, seeing where disruption's taking place, looking at the organisations who are driving substantial change.
Hmm.
And a lot of these organisations are in our everyday lives, the way things have sort of panned out. As I say, if you get in if you're down in London, you might get a black cab, you might actually get in an Uber. And I'm really interested in, what's the service experience like of these organisations as they've come into the sector and they've actually disrupted an existing operating model.
Yeah.
Because if like me, you work with leaders who say, look, the social housing model is broken, right? Okay, well, immediately I'm thinking, okay, well, let's really understand what is broken around that. But then more importantly, right, okay, how do you go about building a new model
Yeah.
that can actually work and you can slot back into the business? And that's complex. That's quite hard sort of corporate innovation to sort of do that. But in terms of sort of some of the experiences and things, I'm just interested in ones that, make me go, wow, I didn't know I needed that, or I didn't know that
Yeah.
that actually would give me that information. And I think there are a lot of companies out there now who are doing some fantastic things with data. I mean, you probably, like myself, Peter, you've seen some of the recent launches around generative AI, the
Yes.
ChatGPT stuff,
Yeah.
Microsoft's new Copilot, for example. All of these sort of technologies have been around a while, but they're now starting to make it into the mainstream. And I think that's when it gets really interesting and really exciting. And I think, from our perspective, from a DIN perspective, we're looking at these technologies and thinking, right, okay, what impact is this going to have on your business as a landlord? What are the roles that basically you're going to have to take a look at again?
Yeah.
Where is this technology going to add value and allow you to free up resources, to give an enhanced experience to tenants and residents? And more importantly, about, how is this going to transform the data that you get as a business that as a leader, you're going to be taking business decisions on?
That's it. And that data, I suppose, what you're really looking for is the actionable insight, and it's using things like AI to surface that actionable insight. I read a really interesting thing on, I think it was on LinkedIn, social media somewhere recently, that said artificial intelligence won't take your job, but somebody that uses it well will do. And I thought that was quite a nice twist on it. Any thoughts on on
Oh,
that?
Yeah, huge amounts around this. And again, this is what we've been trying to sort of talk to sort of, members about. We don't want to be sort of boiling frogs in that pan where the temperature's just getting turned up and we still think it's lovely and warm kind of thing.
Mm,
We need to sort of be, as the whole premise in the word leaders is you are leading, you're at the front. And I suppose a couple of observations around some of these things. So data is a really interesting point around this. Last time I was sort of checking, there was something like 2.5 quintillion terabytes of data out there, and less than 1% of that data is actually analysed. So, that raises a number of questions for me within sort of organizations in terms of, well, actually, data is not the new oil, it's not the new air, it's not the new gold or anything like that. It's only useful if you're actually doing something with it.
yeah.
And unfortunately, we're not in the position whereby we've got access to the skills and the resources of people who can analyze that. A lot of our big corporate partners, the Amazons and Microsoft, are struggling to recruit data scientists, business analysts. And if they are, then housing landlords are surely going to struggle to recruit people of high enough quality and skill to actually analyze the data. So where do we start to get this analytical from? And I think that's where things like generative AI, as it starts to evolve and develop, are going to have to be put to use to analyze some of the data to feed it in. Because ultimately, data is a lag measure. You only get data, after you've actually done something.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's a guide to sort of doing things. But I think technology will change, and I think some of the roles and jobs that we've currently got are the ones that are probably you're going to be looking at and thinking, how's that going to evolve? And it's going to be those ones whereby you have got lots of repetitive tasks in them that you're going to be able to automate some of the workflow around that. I was, as I say, playing about with the generative AI stuff, and I got it to sort of develop a working web page within about a minute,
Wow.
just by putting in some key data. Right, please do this, and it was up there. And I think as we get to play with it, and as we get to evolve with it, and as the tools start to come in, you're going to be in a position whereby you're going to be able to do things quicker, to a higher standard, more consistent standard than we've ever been able to before. And I think my view, the question about sort of your jobs and the roles and things like that, there's lots of talk about machines are going to sort of take over. In my experience, they've never really taken over. They've just enhanced what we've been
Yeah.
able to do. And they free up us as humans to do the tasks which we're good at, which machines aren't necessarily as good around the the empathetic sort of roles, the
Mm,
people roles. And as housing organisations have got more sort of people come to them that have got complex needs, complex issues, you need to spend some time with,
yeah.
then surely that's a good thing for us being freed up to do those things.
Absolutely. I think you touched on earlier about a couple of different approaches to disruption in social housing. I'd like to just pick back into that. So I've seen a couple of approaches, and the first of that being really what DIN's around. So educating housing professionals, bringing their digital literacy up, getting them to think outside the box, introducing them to innovators in the space. And the other that I've also seen is social housing recruiting from outside of social housing. So, any thoughts on a preference or a way forward that you see, or is there room for both?
I think there's room for both, Peter, because again, when you look at the marketplace, certainly within England for social housing, you've got over 1,500 registered providers.
Yep.
As one Sainsbury's director once sort of said to me, it's like the days of the corner shop before supermarkets came along. And I think what we've got to sort of separate out is the uniqueness of the sector in terms of we've got a lot of small providers solving very, very specific needs around whether it's care, whether it's around the elderly, whether it's around sort of the homelessness and things like that. But then you look at the rest of the market and you actually got to start to ask, I suppose, what I would call sort of heresy questions around, well, what happens if we did this? Imagine if we had one technology platform that basically you could all access, personalize and run your landlord services through that. What difference would that start to make? And I think part of the challenge is my members I've not come across any of them who aren't excited by the future. Yes, there might be some trepidation about what it actually means, but that's uncertainty until we get to know how things are. That's a natural sort of reaction. But I think in terms of, you know, going forward, it's actually, we're not frightened of the future. What we're frightened of is actually letting go of the present.
Yeah.
And this is where the educational piece has got to come in, both in terms of what we do, both in terms of the technology providers, so that actually we can demonstrate to people, look, it is possible to build a more efficient and effective operating model over here. And once we transfer it back in, you very quickly see that your current ways of operating are redundant. And ultimately, tenants and residents will get a better experience from the services that you provide. But until you can do that in a way which doesn't make people feel threatened, we won't necessarily see it. Because we have a lot of what I call sort of corporate antibodies when we're trying to sort of drive change. And in my experience, change normally takes systemic change within the business. The way we do business normally takes about 3 or 4 years. So therefore, you've got to have patience. You've got to have commitment. You've got to be quite brave, because, as I say, there'll be things that will come along and knock that off course around this. But, in all my years sort of working in the sector, changes only ever really come about in 2 ways. One is regulatory or statutory sort of change, things like responses to the Grenfell disaster. That's the social housing bill coming in. That's nearly always a lag response, or it comes from boards and executive teams who recognise that the business that they've run can do better and provide better services.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the statutory and regulatory thing drives some huge innovation, and we've seen, when that's happened, some big leaps forward in social housing. But do you think organisational bodies like DIN are going to push that change at a faster rate without regulation and statutory pressures?
Well, I mean, as I say, I come from a premise of, I've worked in the sector for 35 years. I've done most of the jobs within it. And when you come back and you actually go and visit an organisation, and I'm going back to the floor to be a housing officer after Easter, I'll be interested to see whether the things that I was doing in the 80s and 90s are still being done in that way. Because, the last thing I think we want to be doing at this stage is building a faster horse. And, how do we sort of help leaders and organisations make that transition to this very digital world?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the challenges that you alluded to earlier was that about recruiting the right talent. Do you think this is something that social housing is struggling with? And if so, is it a financial issue? Is it just not knowing where to look or recruit the right talent?
I don't just think it's relevant to social housing landlords, Peter. I think the war for talent is sort of, sector blind. Good people out there with the digital skills that are required are in serious demand. So I think we've got to be more creative and think about the way that we do things. I think what the number one skill that we're going to be recruiting for in the future is not experience, because experience in an analog world is not going to be that relevant in a digital one. It's going to be about learning agility. How quickly can you acquire the skills that we need within the business to actually help us develop this? And this, as I say, this is where technology may have a role in terms of sort of sitting alongside people in the landlord services. But ultimately, there's not going to be enough people to go around. And I think this is where, as leaders, we've got to think about things around, our digital literacy. And this is hard. I mean, we don't want to be in a position whereby as soon as we start talking about technology, all right, we pass that to the IT department.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, they're a support service, they're an implementer, that's not necessarily their best role. And I think sometimes we get this dynamic tension between, seeing technology as, oh, well, you've got to be specialist in this area, when actually we very used to working using technology in all its forms in our day-to-day lives. We'll have the smartphones that we use, whether we're using sort of tablets and, technology. The technology we're on to do all of these sort of video conferences and video calls and things like that. And I think we've got to become sort of more hobbyist leaders in terms of, In the same way, we've got to find out more about things like net zero and climate change, but perhaps we've got to add digital as one of the hobbies that we've got to go away and explore.
Yeah.
And that will involve some time. But from my experience, it's a really interesting journey and a rewarding one when you find out about how things work. If you're really struggling and you want to know about TikTok, well, if you've got kids, just go and ask them. There'll be some great explainers there.
Absolutely. I think what you've alluded to there is almost that you don't know what you don't know, and will some landlords struggle with that digital journey because they're not sure what skill sets to recruit, and how can they bridge that gap?
Well, I mean, one of the first sort of reports we did was actually looking at the future of the IT and the digital team. And in a lot of organizations, IT is seen as a support service rather than a strategic advisory one. And our recommendations were very much that, look, if you're thinking of going on a transformative digital journey, then you need your IT team in there as a strategic advisor. So not at the point where the decision's being taken, but actually right at the very beginning when you're looking at the problems you're looking to solve, to sit down with your IT professionals in the business and say, right, okay, this is the problem as we see it. Is this the right problem? How do we go about sort of solving it? And what are the technological solutions in that space? And that requires, as I say, change in organizational structure, perhaps even change in mindset from the IT team, because it's quite a big step up from being a support service to one whereby actually you're given strategic advice about a 3 to 5 year sort of strategy.
Yeah, brilliant. So in a couple of days' time, it's going to be the new financial year, and for many people, particularly in social housing, that's it's like New Year's Day, New Year's resolutions, new notepads, and all that. What would you say to leaders in social housing now wanting to rethink their strategy, their goals, or their adoption of technology?
I mean, the first thing I would probably say is actually innovation certainly is never about the money. Innovation is about timing. And if you've got problems, then actually the best way to solve those problems, and again, these techniques have been out there for sort of a long time, is you go to where the work is, you go to where the issues are, and you sit and observe and you talk and find ways of actually doing it. And then you can go back and think, right, actually, is it the way we're currently operating? How do we tweak the systems and the processes we've got? Is there a better technology that we can bring into the business that will actually help us go quicker, help us reduce cost, help us deliver a better experience? All of those sort of things. So yes, it's a great time to sort of take stock and think, actually, yeah, we can do something. But the challenge for organisations, particularly around technology, is the pace with which it's developing. When we take leaders into an organisation, I always remember this one from Google. Google's welcome is welcome to the slowest day of your life. And what they mean by that is that every day technology is getting quicker and quicker. And your challenge as a leader is to understand, well, what am I going to do to keep up with this? Yeah. And that can be quite challenging, Peter. Because as I say, the pace at which things are going. But we've adapted over many years previously to sort of change. So I don't think it's that. I do think it is a mindset and a cultural piece about the way the world is. And coming back to some of our earlier points, tenants and residents don't exist in a bubble within social landlords. They want to get on with their lives, and they're using the technology that we're probably using as well. So it is our job and responsibility to try and keep up.
Absolutely. Yeah. So all of that wrapped up, what does this next 12 months look like for DIN? What's on the agenda? What's in your calendar, Ian?
Well, I suppose, continuing that journey around educating leaders, improving their digital literacy so they understand the questions to ask of IT teams and technology suppliers, to help sort of, make sure they're getting the right product and sort of service from that. But also looking at the service and the customer experience. How is that changing? What can we do to sort of close the gap between tenant resident expectations and how we respond as a landlord? Understand what is, the purpose of the business. So I'm a big believer in understanding the difference between baggage and heritage. Baggage is things that basically just built up like barnacles on a boat over many years. If you were to scrape them off, would they make any difference to the experience that tenants and residents have got? No, they probably wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
But what's the heritage? What's the what's the stuff that actually makes the business, that landlord business, unique? Is it your geography? Is it the areas in which you work? Is the people who you're there to serve? All of those sort of things. And we've got some great things coming up. We're going to go and look at the world of Formula One in terms of how they use data to make decisions at speed and things like that. We'll be going inside some of the most customer-centric organisations, looking at how they're looking to sort of change. One of my personal favourites will be coming up, best business transformation story I've come across in a long time, which is Greggs, who moved from Greggs the Bakers to Greggs Food on the Go. And it's a fantastic story around, which I suppose is a challenge a lot of leaders have, which is how do you continue to deliver the business as usual whilst making that transition to a new one whilst you do it. And that stuff is quite hard. And we've got some fantastic stuff coming up with IKEA, and particularly focusing on their people and planet positive strategy, which again is how do you basically build the plane whilst you're flying, and build a business which is going to be sustainable long into the future.
I love that. I suppose as a proud lad from the northeast, referencing Greggs, but I love the idea that the home of sausage rolls can play a part in digital transformation in social housing. Love that. Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you ever so much for your time today, and look forward to seeing your next outfit when you're talking about Greggs. Love that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Not at all. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.